Good morning, everyone. I'm Iria Puyosa, a Senior Research Fellow at the Atlantic Council Democracy and Tech Initiative. Welcome to today's discussion on biometrics and digital identification. This morning, we are launching a critical new report, Biometrics and Digital Identification Systems in Africa, Assessment of Governance, Vendors, and Human Rights. Biometric systems are rapidly becoming essential to various fundamental governance and economics processes across Africa, including border registration, border management, government service delivery, and digital payments. Our research findings highlight both the scale and the urgency of this transformation. Currently, 49 African countries operate at least one biometric system, and 35 of these use biometrics in elections. These systems are supported by a complex ecosystem of vendors dominated by transnational companies. Critically, the infrastructure to chase African identity is often developed with limited transparency, weak data protection, and minimal public oversight. Today's discussion will explore these dynamics with leading researchers and civil society experts who are actively engaged in this issue across Africa. We will examine how both the benefits these systems offer and the substantial risks they pose to economic opportunities, democratic governance, and human rights. Before we begin, I would like to express my gratitude to the Embassy of Denmark for its partnership on our project Right Alliance Tech Policy in Africa and to Paradigm Initiative for making this research possible. Now, I would like to hand over the floor to my colleague H.F. Tiendela Fall, visiting fellow at the Democracy and Tech Initiative, who will be had a conversation with the report author Sani Suleiman. Go to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Iria. I'm greatly honored to be moderating the first part of this event, which is the presentation of the report highlights. So I would like to invite Sani Suleiman, who is a programs officer at Paradigm Initiative, but also mainly the author of this important report. And I will be asking him questions so that we can get more insight on the content of the report. My first question for you, Sani, is that this report provides one of the most comprehensive assessments of biometric and digital ID systems across Africa. Could you please walk us through some of the key findings, particularly what stood out the most to you in terms of governance rollout, vendor dynamics, or even human rights safeguards? The floor is to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Iria, Aisha, and the Atlantic Council's team. First, let me say that it was a great privilege to author this work with support from Tobekile Matembe, who is fortunately enough here with us on the call. Also data support from Ida Oluwabemiga, and also editorial support from the Atlantic Council's team. So I'll start by saying that this study is one of the few studies coming out from the continent of Africa, that examines not only the governance of biometrics. I would say there is quite a number of research outputs focusing on the governance, but the vendor ecosystem. We critically look at the vendor ecosystem of the biometric deployment in the continent, and that's where this research critically try to look at and provide a fresh perspective on how the ecosystem it's bearing in the continent. Going back to your question of what stood out, there are so many findings in the research. So many things. Before I started working on it, I had my theories and assumptions, but then as we progress with the report, I was like, oh, okay. For example, I thought when you talk about digital IDs, vendors, you talk about mostly Chinese companies, the ZTEs, Huawei's, and all of that, because this is what I had in mind. But then, first and first is that most of the vendors are actually European vendors, which is one of the things that I get to see. One of the strongest findings is the scale of, not only the scale, I would say, including the speed of my biometric and digital ID expansion across the continent. Nearly every country on the continent, just like Arya mentioned, is deploying biometric system. Some of them for civil registration, some of them for immigration and border control, some of them for healthcare, some of them, SIM registration, and so on and so forth. 49 out of the 54, or you can say 55 sometimes, African countries have at least one biometric system, and 35 out of those 54 uses biometrics in their election. But there is a huge gap, although probably, I don't know if you're going to talk about gaps, we can see a huge gap in the governance itself, the redress mechanisms, and so on and so forth. The second major findings is the outsized role of global vendors and the structural dependencies that it creates. So the system, or rather the ecosystem, it's like a pyramid where you have like the bigger vendors, mostly the European companies supplying the core components and the core infrastructure for the biometric ID system. And then at the bottom of the pyramid, you have the national companies that usually, help in the deployment and grassroots use of those. So that's, we try as much as possible to kind of highlight in an infographic in the research how that ecosystem is looking like. Another thing is, aside the deployment being a national project, it's kind of embedded in the global supply chain and global project ecosystem. For example, most of the biometric projects are being sponsored or co-sponsored by either the World Bank or the European Union in some cases, and other development partners. So there are so many, stakeholders involved in the whole system. But what we are seeing, or the layman is seeing, is just like the national, the national involvement, at that level. Also, the report underscores the convergence between the digital ID expansion and international security cooperation. There was a case of, European Union funding a system called WAPIS in West Africa, trying to control migration, and the data collected from that will be transferred to the central data system, where also the European security agencies will have access to, so they can monitor immigration, they can monitor police records of individuals from the West Africa. So there is a lot of moving pieces and case studies when it comes to the biometric deployment in the continent. So far, this
Thank you so
is
much, Sami.
snapshots, from the report.
Thank you for presenting these findings, and especially highlighting the interesting insights that you got from this research in terms of the stakeholders and the actors. Now, my next question, you touched upon it a bit, and we noted that many African states are rapidly adopting digital ID technologies, and often that is with limited regulatory oversight. So based on your research, if you could just give me 2 to 3 main governance or accountability gaps that you observed and how they affect citizen rights in practice?
Okay. So two or three gaps. I will start with the deployment itself. We can see that there is a minimal, due diligence that goes into the deployment processes. Or even before that, starting with the procurement, there is a lot of politics around who gets what. We have seen, for example, what happened in Madagascar. There is a project of called Prodigy, where the vendors used their kind of related to the current president in the country. So there is, even from the procurement, there is no enough due diligence in there. There is a lot of politics. It's all about which vendor is closer to the government that will get that. That's one of the accountability gaps that we have seen in there. The second one is the possible exclusion of some certain people. In most of the countries in Africa, these systems are deployed with the aim of providing government services, be it civil registration or SIM card registration in the case of the private sector involvement in that as well. So there is a high risk of excluding people that first are not digitally aware on how to, and also doesn't have like the necessary knowledge to proceed to get these things by themselves. In some countries, you have to pay. People are struggling to eat, and then government is asking them to pay for the digital IDs. And without those digital IDs, they can have access to the government healthcare and other benefits that comes with it. So that issue of exclusion is another thing as well. And I think another thing that I would like to add is the weak enforcement of the existing laws. Some of the countries, I do remember the last research, I don't know for now how many, but more than 35 out of the 55 of these countries have a dedicated data protection authority and data protection laws. But those laws, first, is either doesn't provide a specific provisions on how to process and govern and protect people's data, or even if there is no comprehensive mechanism on how to enforce those provisions. So that's another accountability issues. And also there is a disjointed processes when it comes to deployment. I'll give you an example. If you take Kenya, for example, the Huduma number issue, whereby the government went ahead without due diligence, deployed this system. And then, in the other hand, you have the court asking the government to halt that process for now. So had it been there was a due diligence, that could have been avoided. So there is that disjointed processes where the executive part of the government is just like trying to fulfill that contractual obligations, probably from the development partners and so on and so forth, without necessarily carrying out the due diligence that is supposed to be.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sani, for that clarification and the highlights. The report also explores the role of vendors and private sector actors in developing digital ID systems, and you mentioned to us a few of them earlier. What did you discover about how market forces influence identification processes and their subsequent effects on the rights and lives of African citizens. So if you could just clarify to us in practice, how does the fact that you have those vendors and private sector actors outside of the continent, how do they influence the rights of African citizens?
Okay, so that's a very great question, Aisha. I will say that first, starting with the dominance itself, as I said earlier, this space is being dominated by the uh, foreign companies. You're speaking of companies from Belgium, France, mostly, and other European countries. They do have, first, they are very large companies with the necessary, capital to provide those. There are not so many African uh, companies that could provide the necessary infrastructure for us to deploy that. So the governments are being forced to because of the rapid adoption, and also there is timeline attached to most of these contracts. So they are being forced to quickly deploy these systems. And in that, they are trying to look at the companies that have all the necessary, infrastructure and capability to do that within the shortest possible time. So in that process, they also run the risk of, giving out the data of their citizens to these companies, because most of the data centers of these companies are situated in Europe and where else, which means that this data is not even domiciled in the continent where these systems are being deployed. What that means is, what happens to that data? First, the government might not necessarily be able to provide the necessary oversights needed to see that the data is being protected. Second, they can't be too sure that what is happening to that data, of course, because of the distance and also the regulatory requirements. And second, also coming back to the issue of the um, the legal systems that we have. Do you have a robust, legal frameworks to protect that data even outside your countries? We have seen how in Europe, Europe as a bloc uh, do come up with laws that allow them to exercise some oversight if on the data that is not even domiciled in their territories. But we are not seeing the same level of effort from the African counterparts. So this creates, some vacuum on what is happening with the data. Even myself as a researcher, I will admit that I do not know, because throughout the research process, I tried as much as possible to see if we can look at that angle, but there is no enough information to do that. So that's quite a concern, given that the government themselves might not know what is happening with that data. And also, secondly, is the issue of politics. Like I said, there is a lot of politics in this, in some of the countries. I won't say all of them. You have to be closer to the government for you to get that contract. So it's about getting the contract, not necessarily, following the due process and do what is necessary to ensure that people's rights are being protected. But yeah, normally this is what we are seeing happening.
Thank you so much, Sunny. Thank you. This was an interesting presentation, and I hope this gets you all excited about the report as much as we are, because it is indeed a comprehensive report that talks about the vendors, the governments, and the human rights influence. So now I will hand over to Juliet Nanfuka for the next part of this event. She is a research and communications officer at CIPESA and an amazing moderator. So I'm really honored to be moving the baton to her. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and thank you very much, Sunny, for giving us some interesting insights and background on this very interesting report that you have produced. So congratulations on this very hard work. It's a very fascinating area of insight. The relationship between vendors, governments, and human rights. That's exactly what this panel is going to be talking about. What is happening there? How does it look like? How should we be thinking about the business of digital identity, the market behind digital identity? And for that, I'm pleased to be welcoming Grace Mutungu, Tabekele Matimbe, and Yassa Musa in a very insightful panel discussion where they're going to be sharing some very useful insights. So I encourage us all to pay attention to what they're going to be saying. So before we launch into it, we are going to start off with Grace Mutungu, who is a researcher and secretary with the Data Privacy and Governance Society of Kenya. Grace, welcome to the discussion. Now, we've heard some very interesting insights from Sunny, but I wanted to get some opinion from you based on the work that you've been doing over the last couple of years, which highlights the policy dimensions of digital transformation. So in reference to the report, and from your perspective, how can data governance frameworks and regulatory approaches across African countries evolve to ensure that digital ID initiatives are both inclusive and rights-based? Grace, over to you.
Thank you so much, Juliet, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for this discussion that we're having today and for the report. I think one of the main issues I see with digital ID is that we procure the technology before we think about the law and even the problems that we want to solve. So I think one of the things that I resonate with a lot in the report is that aspect of entrepreneurship or the economic aspect of digital ID, where these entrepreneurs are pushing for digital ID for economic reasons, as opposed to starting with what is the problem we're trying to solve and what policy and legal frameworks do we need to have in place in order to solve whatever problem we're trying to solve. So, for example, you find that in Kenya, there has been a lot of research by civil society and community-based organizations highlighting the problem of statelessness, where we have marginalized communities that have faced a lot of barriers in accessing citizenship documentation. But then you find when we start by buying the technology, we want to target the people who already have citizenship documentation to take them to the next level while leaving behind those ones who do not have the documentation in the first place. So this kind of approach where you buy the technology first has been so problematic because we do not even think about the human rights implications of that technology. We do not think about the fitness for purpose of that technology because it's made elsewhere and then brought, and it has to fit. There's always, and it's the last example I'm going to give, there's a picture of a former president trying to really get his fingers to be read by some biometric readers, which had been imported from another country where people probably had different looking fingerprints, but for our president, our former president, he was really struggling. Yet this was a media moment where a big, biometric project was being launched. So you can imagine the implications then for the common person who does not have, redress mechanisms when their biometrics cannot be read. So I think we have to rethink and start from solving the problem and also creating the right legal and policy frameworks before we buy the technology.
Thank you very much for that insightful contribution. But you're right, some of these technologies introduce some form of segregation by design, and they carry this onto the lived experience for some of the communities that exist in our nations. But we'll be hearing a bit more about that from Yessa shortly. So thank you for that. But well pointed out that these tools, we're not resisting them, they just need to be fit for purpose. That means they need to respect human rights, which currently they seem to be jumping over. And to expand on this, I'm going to head over to Tobekile Matimbe, who is the Senior Manager, Partnerships and Engagements with Paradigm Initiative. Tobekile, welcome. Now, in the report, there is a strong emphasis on vendor accountability and human rights, and the human rights risks associated with biometric and digital ID systems in Africa. So in your opinion, how do you assess the roles and responsibilities of tech vendors and governments in shaping digital ID ecosystems in Africa? Big question, but let's hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Juliet. It is indeed a loaded question, right? But yeah, shaping the digital ID ecosystem, I think it starts from the idea of actually deploying biometric systems in the various countries. We've seen a lot of harm come out of the rolling out of digital ID systems on the African continent without proper research or assessment of what human rights impacts would look like. And that in itself is a major, major flaw in terms of the digital ID ecosystem on the African continent. There's no consultations, there's no assessment, there's no deployment of human rights impact assessments, there's no assessment of what's going to happen to data that is collected, through these systems that are being deployed. Obviously, most of these vendors will be outside of the countries where the technologies are being deployed. So there's no built-in sort of, human rights sort of safeguards or guardrails that are put in place, and that in itself is particularly problematic. So as a starting point, I think governments that are deploying technology, whether it's within the context of elections, there is need to be able to assess the human rights impacts that are going to come out of it. There's need to consult with communities, consult with electoral management bodies with regards to the efficacy of rolling out these technologies. There's need to consult with human rights organizations to really look and gather information around what's going to happen. Right now, for instance, there was a lot of outcries in Uganda, where I am at, when there was a discussion of rolling out of biometric voter registration systems and discussions on how some of the tools that were used in the census process of gathering information were intended for the upcoming election in January. But I think that idea was then discarded at some point, and then the government intimated that they were going to procure biometric voter registration systems, which is what they've probably done or are doing. But there's really this opacity that comes with it. There's no transparency as to who is going to be the one that is going to supply the government, and what are they going to deploy, and what are its capacities in terms of capturing the biometrics that are captured, and to what extent data is going to be kept, where it's going to be kept, for how long it's going to be kept. So it's all of those things. There's, apart from the fact that there's no transparency or there's no consultation or human rights impact assessments, there's also this thing that there's no transparency as to actually the suppliers themselves, the vendors themselves, which makes it really something that happens sort of in the night. If you ask me, it's happening in darkness. There's nothing that wants to be put out there by way of clarity in terms of the technologies that are being deployed. And I think that's one of the key things that is there. And in terms of risk, obviously, when you're looking at, for instance, civil registration, and I think Grace already mentioned it, around statelessness, when you look at most of the African countries where these technologies are being deployed, you find that a lot of people have not been, have not had access to national identification as a starting point, birth registration. They don't have access to birth registration. And then you then roll out a mandatory system, whether it's Ndagamuntu in Uganda or whether it's the Huduma number that was, discussed in Kenya. You find that there's no thinking about the adverse impacts, the exclusionary effects of this. So one of those major human rights risks is exclusion. Further widening the exclusion gap when we're looking at those who are vulnerable, those who are underserved in rural communities. So yeah, I think what happens as well from a vendor perspective as well is this kind of thing. There needs to be transparency from their end and due diligence as well. When they are going to operate in a specific location, okay, what are the laws in that country? Are they enabling fundamental rights and freedoms? And it's not just about business expediency, it's about responsibility for human rights. And I know that as activists in the space, we call a lot on telecommunications companies in the context of internet shutdowns, but we do not reflect a lot around the vendors themselves who supply these technologies. We've done some sort of research as Paradigm Initiative in the context of smart city initiatives, for instance, and trying to gather what safeguards are being put in place for human rights. We've tried to engage through research to try and engage with the vendors themselves, some of the vendors, and they're always evasive. They don't want to be asked questions because look, according to them, this is like that kind of arrangement between themselves, private-public partnerships that they're having with governments. And this is between the two parties, and they don't feel that they have a responsibility to disclose. But UN guiding principles on business and human rights have articulated clearly the role of companies. So I think we need to do a lot in the context of biometrics procurement processes to be able to flesh out some of these issues. So when you're looking as well at those who are vulnerable, when we're looking at border controls and the deployment of biometric systems, to what extent are there safeguards to ensure that those who are stateless or internally displaced are not left at the margins of access to to benefits that would benefit them. And we need more transparency, basically, in a nutshell, Juliet, transparency. We need inclusive processes of, determining what to roll out and what to deploy. And also beyond just doing a human rights impact assessment at the beginning of the process, also constant assessment of where we are, even in the process of deployment, to what extent whatever is being deployed, it's really benefiting communities rather than actually posing a threat to fundamental rights and freedoms. So I think that's what I would say. And I've noted as well that, of course, digital IDs are, being, put out there in the open as this wow factor. If you go to, for instance, the Digital ID Summit, it's like it's like, wow, it's an amazing platform where you see companies, they're showing off this and that, and there's very little talks about human rights at that platform. And you have our governments all there and they're engaging, and it's business and they're excited, and some novel technologies that are being rolled out without really considering what is at stake. And I know that at continental level as well, the African Commission currently really is putting out a call to support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information, to speak to what should be appropriate guidelines that should be out there in terms of data and what happens with data collection and data at the continental level. How can data that is collected by any system be able to bring value to the African people as opposed to posing a threat? So with that reflection, I'll keep it at that, Juliet, and pass the baton back to you.
Thank you very much, Tobekile. As we can all see, Tobekile really wants to get to sink her teeth into this topic. But while we have you here, Tobekile, very briefly, how can civil society effectively influence the policies, the current landscape, to ensure that ID systems are transparent and prevent exclusion? You've partially touched on this from the vendor's perspective, but what should civil society do more proactively? Very briefly.
Thanks. I won't dig too deep into it. So I'll start with obviously challenging it when there are violations of human rights is a starting point. We've seen this in Kenya with the Huduma number, and I think that's one of the biggest success stories of challenging digital ID systems that are not rights respecting. I think the second one is to obviously engage at policy level, to engage around procurement processes and question any intimation of any procurement of biometric technologies, to question to what extent it's going to further human rights, and to also question where these technologies are being procured from, and also to question how they're going to be deployed and what will happen to the data that's collected, and also to engage as well on basically what should happen in terms of transparency, both from governments and the vendors themselves that are involved in the chain process, where there's that access to those vendors, and also obviously rolling out access to information laws, because sometimes there's no proactive disclosure of this information. So also making sure that we deploy access to information laws to be able to access relevant information around the procurement processes would be really instrumental. And obviously coalition and coalescing around calling out for human rights in the context of digital IDs, where we see that there's been an ignoring or circumventing of consultations and transparent accountability.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, all of you, as the speakers, Grace, Tobekile, Sunny, and they have pointed out to communities that are excluded. And to that point, I'd like to invite Yasan Kimei, who is a project manager with the Nubian Rights Forum based in Kenya. Now, Yasa, drawing from your work with marginalized and stateless communities in Kenya, what safeguards does the report suggest African countries must prioritize to ensure that biometric digital ID systems do not deepen exclusion, especially for communities whose citizenship is already contested? Kenya has a very fascinating case, multiple cases of excluded communities. Let's hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet, and the good presentation that has been done, and also for my colleagues. A lot has been said, and I'm so happy that there is a report that has already been produced in Africa, because one of the safeguards that I can say before I continue is making sure that the African Union are the ones given the mandatory or the mandate to come up with extensive data protection act that should be followed by all these countries. When you look at the examples and from the normal and the norms in African countries, most states, they are dictators. So the dictatorship in themselves cannot allow them to just implement digital identity without putting legal measures into place. So looking at this, Nubian Rights Forum, we've been working with communities to empower them to apply for identification cards. And based on this, these communities are excluded from access to documentation. And during the Huduma number case from 2019, I think up to now, there was issues that we were talking about, including data protection. We need to make sure that the data that is collected is needed. When you look at Kenya and other African countries, they are using centralized system, meaning all information is placed under one place. So like in Kenya, the Ministry of Interior is the one that is in charge of all the information. So we have a population registry that is controlled by one power. We risk these ones because anyone who wants to exclude you, by a press of a button, you are excluded. By a press of a button, you're also included. So these are risks when it comes to data protection. Weak accountability, procurement processes. The governments may have to make sure that they provide information on how procurement is done, how these decisions were made, instead of coming up with a bill that they've already discussed without involving people. Grace talked about the government coming up with a project and then reversing it back. This is the same thing that happened with Kenya. They didn't have Data Protection Act. It is in place. When you look at access to internet, Kenya has access to internet of around 32%. digital literacy, they have around 27%. So if only 27% of Kenyans can be able to access or use digital platforms, it means that a huge majority of people, you're locking them out. Extra vetting for minority groups. When you look at, when you're going for a job opportunity, you will be vetted. Who are you? Bring your documents, your university credentials. And we've seen recently our foreign minister saying that we will be using digital ID to vet you so that you can be given a visa. So that means the silencing dissent. So if you attack the government, they use social media, they use other platforms to deny you access to travel, internet access. When you look at Kenya, also just using the Kenya, access to internet, to electricity is low. So we need to make sure that accessibility is there. Security profiling, looking at the normal, the Kiza Besigye case, the Hanifa cases, the current cases in Uganda, Tanzania, where you're seeing people being abducted. So all this is information being shared by private companies. And this, when you look at Africa Uncensored, they have removed a report showcasing how Safaricom have been working with government officials to share information and to abduct people. So we need to make sure that people are given transitional period, because in Kenya, they came up and say, we are launching digital ID. And then they didn't even give Kenyans a time to process, understand what is this, and then move forward. They came with a pilot and then included digital identity. This poses exclusion to communities who do not know how to read. We have to make sure that we use open source and bring interoperability. When the system fails, nobody works. So, for instance, eCitizen, when it fails, eCitizen is a digital ID in Kenya that is used for government services. And there has been speculations that a government or private partner in South Africa is the one that owns. And whether they own or they don't, when you look at how the system fails and the time that it takes for them to repair this system, we've lost a lot of people, we've lost a lot of opportunities, and these opportunities cannot be reversed back. So the Kenyan government and also the private sectors, they need to make sure that they involve grassroots organizations, people who are the service, the ones who use these goods. Because at the end of the day, when you're selling your goods, you're selling to people who can be able to use it and they know how to protect it. Creating human-led mechanisms. Creating human-led mechanism means that we need to make sure that these things can be able to be highlighted and be used by anyone. I think the next ones I can be able to present later on. And I think to just finalize with, we have to make sure that digital identity is not politicized. Digital identity is not exclusionary. And when we're thinking about Vision 2030, we have to think about what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. If it doesn't make sense, then we have to think about how do we bring it together to influence other people. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So another theme added to the discussion, and that's the theme of human rights assessments. What is the spectrum of human rights that are assessed when the rollout of these tools are effected? Who is part of the ID system? Who is left out, and what is the consequent impact there? This is a huge topic, and I'm sure there are lots of people who'd like to make a contribution to this discussion or have some queries. We welcome you to share your questions if you have any, and yeah, we'll take it from there. Any questions from the audience? We'll give a few seconds. The audience is thinking. I have a question for Grace, and Grace, as we get our questions from the audience, I have a question for you, and that is about the recurring challenge of the absence of, or rather the limited awareness by citizens, and consequently their low levels of trust in digital ID programs, what practical strategies would you suggest from communication to participatory design can governments and civil society adopt to build greater public confidence and ownership? Very, very briefly, what would be your opinion on that? And I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm sure you can handle this comfortably.
Thank you for the question. So a lot of times we in the research space talk about digital ID as a very complicated thing. But actually, if you break it down, a lot of people understand what it is. Why? Because in a lot of countries, it is the thing without which you cannot access services. You can't get, let's say you're looking for a job as a driver, you can't get the driving license unless you go to that portal and get your digital ID, then apply for the driving license. So one thing we need to do in our work is to make it more, is to vernacularize digital ID, and so that people can understand what it is that we're talking about, which is something that really affects them. I think we're in a very good position in many African countries because we have many young people who are digital natives in one way or another. And so they more easily understand digital ID. And so we can make digital ID debates more participatory by including youth and their experiences with citizenship documentation and access to government services in advocating for better frameworks for digital ID. So that is something that that we really need to do. I think at a bigger level, we need to create our own technology because there's a lot that is being done by these young people, and they do understand technology, and they're able to make technology that responds to our issues as Africans. So we for the longer term, we need to harness the energy of and the existing resource that is these young people to create our own technology that responds to our own issues and then benefits us as ourselves, as Kenyans would say, us ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response, Grace. And yes, a lot of thinking to be done there, but as you are nearing the end of your response, it related quite well to a question that is coming from the audience. And that is whether the research utilizing the report explored DPI methodology and GASTAC in terms of digital identity management. And the question is around how it could potentially mitigate data protection risks. So I'll ask the question again. Did this research explore the DPI methodology and GASTAC in terms of digital identity management and how it could potentially mitigate data protection risks? Sunny, this is a question that I think you'd be best suited. Let us not think about Cloudflare going down yesterday. We'll put that aside and put on our hats for today that is most relevant to the discussion that we're having at hand. So Sunny, over to you.
All right, thank you. Well, there is two parts to that question. Rather a comment. First, there is a question whether we did that, and then there is a suggestion whether those, suggested methodologies could be used to mitigate. So that's another avenue to carry out, further research on that. But no, we did not consider that. Basically, what the instrument we used to guide, the assessment, the UNDP model governance framework for digital legal identity systems, which is a very well-known instrument. So we use that to assess that. And I think the second instrument is the evaluation framework for digital identities developed by the Internet and Society Center for Internet and Society, CIS. So these are like the two instruments that we use to guide the assessment. But yeah, I believe that answers the question.
Thank you very much for that. It's quite a huge question, but I think a very good question. But it also gives us ideas on what more we should be thinking about when it comes to research into digital ID and DPI, which is the interlinked, but also presenting very, very interesting dynamics that we need to be aware of and we need to be thinking about going forward. Any further questions, please do feel free to enter your questions into the chat box. We're welcoming anything, but also reactions to the report that you may have found, or basic reactions to the contributions that have been made by our speakers. We welcome that. But in the meantime, I'd like to get us to start winding up this discussion. 1 hour is a very small amount of time to discuss this huge topic, but nonetheless, we welcome, thank you. We thank you all for joining us today. But I'd like us to start winding up, and in very, very brief words to our speakers, based on the findings of the reports, what specific policy recommendations can at least give us one policy recommendation that can help us in developing rights-based and transparent digital ID ecosystems in Africa? You have touched upon this in some of the contributions you have made, but in one sentence, essentially, let us get one policy recommendation that you'd like to reinforce. We'll start with Grace once again.
Thank you, and no pressure. I think one policy recommendation that I like, which comes out in the report and also is from the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, is that every person has a right to public services. We really keep forgetting that and placing technology before people, yet every person has a right to public services. So whether those public services are coming digitally or through artificial intelligence, we should always remember that every person has a right to those services. So thank you for that, for the report.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So everyone has a right to public services. A very strong recommendation. Thank you for that contribution, Grace. Tobekile, let us hear your one specific policy recommendation.
Thank you. I think mine is on transparency of procurement processes. This is very important. So this is a big one as well. And I think it's something that needs to be implemented so that at least the checks and balances are effected well when there's transparency.
Thank you for that. And I'll reiterate, transparency in procurement processes. Absolutely, we need that. We have no idea what is going on in the background. The level of opacity in this industry is particularly scary. So thank you for that. And finally, Yasa, what is your specific policy recommendation on developing a rights-based and transparent digital ID ecosystem in Africa?
For me, I will say leave no one behind, just the same way Grace has said. Leave no one behind. Allow transitional periods so that people can understand the system, can log into the system. For those excluded, can be included, and remove the issue of decentralization. We don't need to be controlled by one entity. So allow decentralization of systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So leave no one behind, but at the same time, let us look into decentralization. Once again, knocking on Cloudflare's event of yesterday, we need to think broad and have multiple points of entry. So thank you very much for that. And once again, to everybody who's participated and contributed to the report, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to see such work coming out. At CIPESA, we're also very keenly following and producing work on digital ID. So it's great to see the body of evidence growing on a daily basis, the arguments building upon arguments and bodies of evidence, or other cases being developed, but also more importantly, the responses and reactions as you've been making in the recommendations. So at this point, I'm going to hand back to Iria. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time.
Thank you, Juliet. Before we close the event, I would like to invite Sani Suleiman to recap the recommendations included in the report. Go to you, Sani. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Iria. So there are about there are about 9 recommendations in the report, and those recommendations are mostly focusing, on the structural and also legislative, you know, recommendations on how to govern this ecosystem properly. The first one, we recommend that there should be an independent oversight agencies with full autonomy. What we have seen in the case of data protection authorities is those authorities they are not as independent as it is in their name. They are called independent data protection authorities, but they are not independent. But for us to have that transparency and right respecting approach to the deployment, we need an independent oversight bodies. Also, we need to enact comprehensive and enforceable legal frameworks, specifically speaking to the biometrics deployment in the continent and also at the national level. Another recommendations is about transparency, just like what Tobikile mentioned, and also the fourth one is to integrate human rights due diligence for all contracts. Like I have mentioned earlier, some of these contracts are not as transparent as they should be. Many people do not know about, the what is happening behind the scene before, during, and after the deployment of these systems. Another recommendation from the report is to create continuous oversight and remedy mechanism, not just at the beginning, but also throughout the life cycle of this systems. And another one is to embedding a right-based governance model, also, at the country level to develop frameworks that are right-based and also that can be deployed alongside the systems. Second to the last is the promotion of regional cooperation and harmonization. We have seen quite few instances where there is some continuous regional cooperation. I know in West Africa there is an attempt to have a single ID system for it is 320 million citizens. However, as we speak, three of the countries are kind of no longer part of the bloc and are trying to come up with a different one. So in my opinion, it will be a bit much easier and better to regulate when we have a better coordination across countries. And the last one is building domestic technical capacity. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of dependencies on these companies because of course, the technical and capital capacity that they do have. So these are some of like the recommendations, but you can read them, in details when you have access to the report. Thank you, Iria.
Yeah, thank you, Sani, for summarizing the report recommendations. And thank you, everyone who joined us today as an audience, to our panelists and our great moderators, Aisha and Juliet, for this deeply informative discussion. What we heard this morning underscore why this conversation matter. I want to highlight before closing some of the more important critical takeaways. First, the transparency gap. There is an accountability problem here. These are no minor administrative tools. These technologies serve as a gatekeepers who can vote, who access to healthcare, open bank accounts, or cross borders. Second, the vendor dependency crisis. As we discussed it, African governments are outsourcing core identity infrastructure to foreign technology firms. This creates a structural dependency in which sensitive citizen data is managed externally and procurement offices occur behind closed doors, as some of our panelists mentioned. Third, the risk. While governments frame this as an efficiency, it dramatically expanded risks, excluding citizens without foundational IDs from exercising their rights. These are not hypothetical risks. They are documented harm affecting real people today in Africa and in other parts of the world also. But our report also offers solutions. We have 7 concrete policy recommendations that Sunny just summarized. These recommendations require action from multiple actors. Governments must strengthen legal frameworks and oversight. Civil society must continue demanding transparency and accountability. Regional bodies like the African Union must harmonize standards for data protection and data governance, and development organizations must ensure their funding doesn't inadvertently enable surveillance infrastructure and other human rights harms. I want to close by thanking the research team led by Sani Suleiman, whose work made this report an essential resource for policymakers, advocates, and technologies across the continent and in other parts of the world where these technologies are being deployed. Thank you to our partners at Paradigm Initiative and to the Embassy of Denmark for the crucial support for this project. The report will be on the Atlantic Council website. We encourage you to download, read, discuss, and use in your advocacy work in digital ID system. Thank you very much.